How would you compare India's growth in this decade compared to the decade before this? Because, we've seen GDP growth rates in India have been fairly phenomenal in the previous decade as well, rates above 8%. But in this decade, they did actually come down to less than 4%, even before the pandemic of 2019. So while the Morgan Stanley report says that India is transformed under this government, how does it compare with the economy state under the last government?
I'll make 2 points here. That's a very good question, by the way. So the first point is it's not about absolute growth because we don't live isolated. We are in a planet with many other countries, and what happens to the world at large has direct impact on India. So it's always about relative growth. How quickly are we growing versus our peer set or versus the world? And the second is about all the fixing that the economy had to undergo, say between 2013, 14 and 2019. Due to some of the things that had happened in the preceding 5 years. So with respect to relative growth, actually if you look at the numbers, we are now accelerating versus the world. So for example, India is under 4% of the world economy. Okay, so the world economy is sized at just about $103 trillion. We are at under 4 trillion. So we're less than 4% of the world economy. This year, we'll account for 17% of global growth. So on a relative basis, even though on an absolute basis it seems like we have a modest growth rate of say 6% the relative picture is very much in favor of India. What has happened in the last few years is that world growth has also slowed down. And the world is certainly a lot challenged now versus where it was in the first decade of the millennium.
Sure.
Because it's aging and because it's got a lot of debt. So that's the first thing. The second is that, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, India did make a few policy mistakes, and that resulted in a pretty severe banking crisis, and it also resulted in very high inflation. Now, a lot of that took a while to get fixed. We are now arrived at a situation where I dare say Indian banks are probably the best in the world.
Right.
So our financial sector is has got, technically it's one of the best in the world, and we have more or less nailed inflation. And, the evidence of that is, look at what's happening in the Western Hemisphere. The US, Europe, places which have not experienced inflation for 40 years are struggling to fix their inflation, whereas India is actually looking far more benign.
Sure.
So that is, I think, the context of, when you make a comparison of absolute growth rates, this context is lost.